My name is Jens Lindemann. I'm a professor of trumpet here at UCLA in Los Angeles, and I have spent most of my career primarily as a soloist and a chamber musician, touring with the Canadian Brass for about 6 years. And my primary thrust in the last 20 years has been to perform as a soloist in this industry. Well, I came by the trumpet accidentally because I had in fact wanted to be a drummer. And the only way you could be a drummer in our band was to choose trumpet or clarinet. Then we had tests after the first 2 weeks, and the best players could decide if they wanted to be percussionists, and I was dead last out of 20 trumpet players, so I wasn't allowed to quit band. My mother said, you have to do it for a year, and then you can decide. And so the trumpet kind of picked me. In that first year, I was introduced to a Doc Severinsen record and a tune that we played in band written by Jay Chataway called Spanish Fever, and it had a little trumpet solo in it, and by the time I got that far into it, I was hooked. The program here at UCLA revolves primarily around private instruction in my case. We have anywhere from 10 to 14 trumpet players, trumpet majors that are here, both performance and education majors. And we have some brass ensembles, of course, that we put together, both in quintet and sometimes slightly different formats than that, that also require coaching. But primarily my involvement with the students here is in a one-on-one direct contact situation as opposed to teaching classes and doing lectures and seminars. What I look for when I'm auditioning a student is attitude, in the best possible sense. I remember that when I auditioned at Juilliard, I remembered asking my teacher many years later, he's now a good friend, how in the world I got into Juilliard when they picked 2 or 3 trumpets out of 80 or 90 that had auditioned. And he looked at me and he said, you know, you had a big old chip on your shoulder. I could see it and I wanted to knock that off. And what he was really saying, of course, was not that you should come in with ego in a negative sense, but rather that you had some type of personality that would that an instructor that was really careful and was nurturing could hone. I'm very fond of saying my job is not to crank out professional musicians. I'm here to help enlighten young people about what their possibilities are in our industry, either as performers or as educators or people that work in the booth or in a corporate law type situation for music. There's so many facets of getting involved in the industry. So what I look for are people that have the lights on, so to speak, as opposed to just finding what I call trumpet meatheads. There are many of them out there as well, but that's not really what I'm interested in nurturing. The auditioning process is very simple as far as I'm concerned. Be honest. Be honest in how you present something. Don't try to impress me or anybody else that's sitting out there. It can't be done in that sense, but young people think that they have to impress judges or adjudicators when they come to audition for anything. The thing that people are really looking for is integrity. Whatever integrity you happen to be offering that day. That doesn't necessarily mean playing a note-perfect audition. It's just like having a conversation with somebody where if you are presenting yourself in an open manner, people respond to that. And if you're sort of trying to figure out the situation, holding back, people will respond to that too, and usually not in a positive way. Music, the arts in general, actually the arts very specifically, have to be motivated from a place of honesty and integrity. If you don't believe what you're presenting, nobody else will believe it. So that's basically what I try to look for, is that type of attitude in people when I hear them play and speak to me when I interview them as well. I think a trumpet player must play both effectively, at least to have some knowledge of the differing styles. When I was growing up, there was a very traditional delineation between a classical player and a jazz player. I was very fortunate in the programs that I was in to have played many different styles of music. And if trumpet players were really to stop and think about the history of our instrument, if you're looking at the last 300 years from the Renaissance and Baroque, where we were actually revered in society, those days have long gone. But we've had an impact in every single major musical form for the last 300, 350 years. Renaissance, Baroque, classical, once you got into big romantic symphonies, the turn of the 20th century, where you now had jazz exploding, then the pop revolution. I mean, Penny Lane without a trumpet solo is not Penny Lane. If you look at how many areas the trumpet has been involved in key moments in musical history, you could very arguably make the case that there is no other instrument that has had as broad a reach. As a result, we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to the lineage of our instrument to look at as many styles as possible. So this notion of being a classical player or a jazz/pop contemporary performer, that's about as old school as I can possibly imagine. It's something I try to beat out of students. Not literally, of course. Look, I think when you audition for any teacher, you shouldn't be looking at the school per se. There are elements of the school that are very, very important. But what you get out of a private instructor at the college level, that's the most intimate relationship you're going to have with any professor. That's a one-on-one relationship as opposed to even being coached in a small group and certainly in a seminar class where you could have 50 to 100 people. This is true mentorship in the best sense. And that's what ultimately should be the most important variable if you're choosing a music school. Who will you be working with? What does he or she bring to the table? What's their expertise? Try to look at what they've done, look at their lineage. If that's the kind of thing that turns your crank, you'll know. In fact, young people, although they may not know literally what they're trying to accomplish, they do know instinctively. It's like opening up the musicians' union and you look at the back to see where the orchestra openings are, if that's your thing. And you could be pawing through it and then one or two will just tend to jump off the page and you get that inner excitement that we all understand. It's that X factor of the arts that you can't quantify or explain. You just get excited thinking about that being a possibility. That's the exact same notion that you should bring to the table when you're looking for a private teacher. It should be somebody you want to emulate. Why would you study with somebody that you don't really admire? And there could be lots of ways to admire somebody. But that's a very personal journey that at an instinctive high school level can be done. Unfortunately, too many high school students in particular, and I notice this in America more than in Canada, which is where I'm from, there is a true sense of regionalism that exists here that I didn't grow up with. In Canada, if you were living in Quebec and you wanted to go study in BC, people didn't come recruiting across the country. That didn't really exist, but there's such a push to recruit, to carry on tradition of schools, either where your own teacher had studied or where your high school teacher says is the best place. I mean, all these different kinds of pulls on students. At the end of the day, listen to all of that advice, but make up your mind based on a gut instinct and take a chance. Your gut will always be basically correct. I think that being a well-rounded and well-educated individual is a critical element to becoming a good musician. One of the things we pride ourselves in at UCLA is that this is a very renowned research institution, arguably the most famous public school in terms of research institutions in the world. As a result, students here are not simply taking conservatory-oriented music courses. There are a lot of general ed courses that they also have to take. And this is all part of the process of growing up, finding yourself, as it were. I mean, if you're really honest with yourself, as a high school student, the day you start college is the day you're an adult. I can't call home to your parents and say, Johnny's not practicing. I mean, you're on your own at this point. So it's up to you to decide how you want your life to evolve at that point. Whereas prior to that, you had a curfew. You had to come home. You had responsibilities. So as a result, the process of finding out who you are is very much a process of a 4-year undergraduate program at a university. And so doing as many things as possible, I absolutely encourage it. If I have to think of my own heroes on the trumpet, the first name that comes to mind is Doc Severinsen. Doc embodies, in my opinion, everything that a trumpet player could be. A virtuosic grasp of the instrument, an understanding that you were there as a performer to present to an audience. There was nothing self-indulgent about the way Doc performed when he was on TV and when he was doing live concerts. It's a very inclusive form of presenting who you are. I love that. I'm not really a fan of what I call performers that expect an audience to get it. You know, those are terms that we use as musicians, and they're important terms for us to use because we have to understand that we're listening to the musical language in a way that many other people don't necessarily understand because of the fact that we have studied it. But at the end of the day, you have to find a way to present that to an audience. Otherwise, you don't have a career. You just be in your practice room practicing all day and never performing for anybody. Classically speaking, I have to point to Maurice Andre as my other consummate hero. And I've had a chance to meet Maurice several times and watch him perform. And he has a joie de vivre when he gets on stage. It embodies enthusiasm and lightness of spirit. And for me, that's the ultimate way to perform. That kind of attitude is what you need to bring to the concert stage. And you can learn that at a very young age. I think it really comes down to trusting that what you have to say is important and viable. And even if it's not presented perfectly, if it's done honestly, People will understand that, and they'll relate to it, and they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Rafael Mendez continues to scare and inspire every trumpet player that's ever picked up the instrument. I mean, Mendez took the trumpet, and one of the things he accomplished that I've always admired him for is that he helped break down the stereotype of the instrument. He was not content doing repertoire written for the trumpet. He would take pieces written for the violin. He played the trumpet like a violinist. He let people, the reason people left his concerts with their jaws on the floor was simply because he had such a dexterity, something that you wouldn't expect when you see a trumpet player holding up an instrument. I've carried or tried to carry that motto with me for as long as possible. In fact, I'm very fond of telling students the greatest compliment you can get after a concert, if somebody comes up to you and says, you know, that one thing that you did, it didn't even sound like a trumpet, that was more like a clarinet or an oboe. I mean, if you've done that, then you've helped eradicate the myth of what people expect a trumpet to be doing. Why would you do anything that people expect? To be an artist, you should try to push the envelope, find your own voice, and do things that people aren't expecting. Then you're vital, then you're viable, and then you'll be noticed. Mark Gould was my teacher in New York. He was the principal trumpet of the Metropolitan Opera. And he's the consummate example of somebody who was a spectacular principal trumpet in a major orchestra, playing with the greatest conductors and singers of his day. And also such a creative musical individual, a great jazz artist, a great contemporary artist. He's actually doing a lot of rap music right now, writing and in a very artistic manner, I might add. Mark is a very creative individual, and I feel very, very fortunate that I got to work under his tutelage, because he got inside my head and he made me think for myself. He didn't want to turn me into a robot. That was the last thing he wanted, and that's what I try to do with my own students, to bring that out in them. That is absolutely the correct approach to take. The more an instrument can literally become an extension of you physically, the more you're going to start to be able to realize your own potential. Which is why one of the critical things that I talk to trumpet players about is not the mouthpiece necessarily, or the lead pipe, or simple things like having good posture and breathing well. Of course we have to talk about that. But you have to talk about the entire body being involved. No part of your body can be cut off from the aspect of your body that's playing. Meaning that, how many times do we think about unlocking our knees when we're standing? Not standing there rigid at attention, looking petrified, but rather looking like the instrument, and that you yourself are so comfortable on stage that everything appears to be fluid. That's when you start understanding that the instrument itself is literally a floating connection of what you are imagining presenting. And it's a lifelong pursuit trying to get to that point of comfort. But when you do arrive there, you realize that you're just taking a piece of metal and you're blowing through it. It's that simple and that complicated at the same time. Tone production is probably the most important thing that you can develop on the instrument. You can play auditions, you can play for competitions, you can play in a number of different settings where people will be judging you, quote unquote. And if you have a fantastic tone, you can get away with murder. If somebody has a problem with some stylistic thing that you're doing, a way you're playing eighth notes, your tempo, your volume, and you don't have good sound, they are far more apt to start criticizing openly. But if you aren't necessarily following those elements of what they think should be happening, but you've got a great sound, it's human nature to simply say, well, it wasn't quite what I was, but what a sound. That's the most important thing you can develop. As far as I'm concerned, trumpet players ultimately shouldn't really listen to other trumpet players in terms of getting to the next step. You have to listen to trumpet players initially. I like to call it the circle of trumpet life, where at day one, the top of the circle, you're just trying to make a sound and you're happy if anything comes out. And then somewhere right at the bottom of the circle, I call this trumpet purgatory. And this is where we spend most of our time for most of our careers, talking about mouthpieces and lead pipes and recordings and who's doing this and who's doing that. All the things we love to talk about as trumpet players, but that ultimately don't really mean anything. But you have to go through purgatory in order to get out and try to get back to the top of that circle. The place of pure innocence, where you're just presenting something that's important to you. And the beautiful part about such a simple analogy is that you can never get back to that first pure moment. You're always striving for it. You get close. Now, one of the ways to do that is by not only listening to trumpet players and trumpet recordings and going to concerts, but more importantly, as my teacher at Juilliard said, you can't just listen to that. You sound like a meathead. You got to listen to some singers. You got to listen to some violinists, some, woodwind quintets. You sound like a meathead. You play like a meathead. You want to be a meathead? Listen to trumpet players. That's just part of the process. And it was absolutely right. So developing tone has to do with developing a really vivid imagination. And once you have that, boy, the sky's the limit. Most of my methodology is not based on what I would call traditional trumpet routine. Said a different way, I ask every one of my students, the first day they walk in, what do you want to be? You can dream as big or as small as you want. I don't care. You tell me what you want to be, and I will show you how to get there. There's no mystique for me as far as what the trumpet is about anymore. I mean, the instrument itself does not hold that kind of mystical allure that it did when I was younger. Meaning that I can show you how to do it. Now, the catch is, are you willing to pay the price to accomplish the thing that you would like to do? Some students are, some students are not. As a result, I tailor my routines and my methodology toward the individual needs of that student. If he or she wants to push the envelope, I'll push it with them as far as they want to go. But a lot of people don't necessarily want to do that. They may say they do at the beginning. But part of the process of being in university and studying with a mentor in an apprentice relationship is also discovering that there are many, many other strengths that you have. I'm very fond of telling every one of my students that every one of them does something better than anybody else in the studio, so that they understand they all have something to offer, and it's a question of finding that and gleaning that and honing that particular skill to discover what it is that you are ultimately being called to do in the arts. And that might mean leaving music altogether, going into engineering, into law, to sciences, becoming an enthusiast for music. I'm very fond of telling them that the idea of arts and patronage has always coexisted. We must have people that will support artists in their endeavor, and we as artists have to understand that that relationship is a coexistence. It's very symbiotic. So the journey along the way takes people in directions that they usually didn't imagine when they started out. And I find that part of it really fun at the college level. The format that I would use for a private lesson, again, comes down to what that individual student's needs are for that particular, either that lesson or something that they have coming up. Generally, I like to tell students that certainly if I'm working with them on a regular basis, that I see them an hour a week. But there are in a week, 170, 180 hours in the week? That's a lot of time for you to be on your own. A lot of time where I can't keep an eye on you, and quite frankly, I don't care about what you're doing. You've got a life, I've got a life. Meaning that all the work that you put into a lesson, it's like punching the time clock. Practice time in a room is work time. You're not looking for some higher artistic ideal in a practice room. You're doing some grunt labor, the kind of thing that a lot of students don't necessarily, understand how to do it. As a result, the lesson, or the performance, if you want to use a different analogy, is ultimately a reflection of the work that you've put into leading up to that moment. One of the simplest tips that I can give students leading up to getting ready for a major performance or a private lesson that they really want to do well at, which should be all the time, quite frankly, because it's not the teacher's job to make you a better player. It's your job to bring the problem to the teacher and for him or her to analyze that. But a really simple technique to maximize your time efficiency is to use a stopwatch. I have one that I never travel without. I set it on a 10-minute timer, and I'll work on a very, very small component of music. It might just be one bar of something that I'm practicing. And I will diligently and creatively work for 10 minutes on just that. When the timer goes, I reset it, and this is the important part, and then I do something completely different. Not the same thing. It doesn't matter how close I was to cracking it open. Do something else. When the timer goes off again, you might go back to the first thing that you did. You might try a third thing. If students did that in 6 little segments, that's an hour of practice, and it's an hour of highly focused practice. And if you understand that those little building blocks will help you put the whole product together, you'd be amazed at how much more you would get done with those work hours when your teacher's not present. It's having that kind of creativity that leads to better lessons, quite frankly. And it leads you to want to get to that lesson so that once you get into the door and you're with your private instructor, you're really excited about something that you want to talk about, something that you've done, something that you can't do, but you really have a focused idea of what's supposed to happen. As opposed to, Many times just showing up and saying, well, I have a lesson at 2 o'clock. I guess I'll see what it's going to be all about. It has to be the exact opposite approach if you really want to succeed. I do encourage some practicing in front of a mirror, particularly if I see a lot of embouchure movement moving from one range of the instrument to the other. The greatest players I've ever seen play really look like they're not working at all. It looks effortless, and that's what we admire about them. Well, guess what? It is effortless, and they figured out a way to make it effortless. And one of the absolute truths of every major player I've ever seen that has done that is that there is a minimal amount of overt embouchure movement. Sometimes with younger players you might see some cheek puffing, especially once you start getting down to the lower register. It's very easy to just sort of relax the embouchure. You're not playing high. The problem is now if you want to get from a low G into middle G and then G on the staff and beyond that, you have to make a lot of adjustments in order to hold the embouchure in place. The more moving parts, the less efficient you're basically operating. So when I see a lot of unnecessary embouchure movement, I'll have a student stand in front of a mirror just so that they can see what's going on, because often they're not cognizant of that. You see it as the observer, but they don't because they can't see themselves. I do think you can go too far with that, though. Some people really become obsessed with looking in the mirror. It's like anything. You have to use it as a tool and not the absolute be-all, end-all of what it is that you're using to become a better player. Very rarely do I change somebody's embouchure. On a pure technical note, one thing I will tell you is a philosophy that I adhere to very strongly is that I believe that in general, and when I say in general, I'm talking about 90% of trumpet players out there play a mouthpiece that's too big. They end up playing a rim size that is something that's more likely to be performed in a larger symphony orchestra for the sake of generic size purposes. Let's say a Bach 1 anything, a 1 or a 1.5, 1 1/4. The Schilke Yamaha equivalent would be anywhere from a 16 and up to 18 and 20. For some reason, there's a notion that develops with young players that you start off on something that's much more, and I never say small, I call it compact. It's a different way of thinking about it. We start on a more focused rim like a 7 or a 5C, again using Bach numbers as a general rule. And young players feel that they have to, in order to really evolve, end up playing a big mouthpiece in order to really become true professionals. I don't think there's been a greater myth perpetuated in the trumpet community in the last 30, 40 years. I'm not telling people you have to play something smaller. I am saying you can play something smaller. It's your choice, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And as a result, I'm very, very fond of working with students when I hear that there's more effort needed in playing the trumpet, specifically from, say, a G on top of the treble clef staff and up. If they're working harder than I think they need to be working, we tend to scale it back. And 9 times out of 10, what that comes down to is the size of the mouthpiece. So I encourage a more compact rim size and then messing around with the cup depth, depending on how you want your ultimate tone to be presented. So as far as changing the embouchure itself, rarely do I do that. I only make general comments if I hear something really or see something going on that's pretty bizarre. But in general, most of it will take care of itself if you have a strong idea of how you would like to focus the sound within the mouthpiece that you're playing. Breathing needs to be addressed without the instrument first and foremost. We need to understand that the concept of breathing for a wind instrumentalist, if you're talking about just using daily breathing intake to get around, to talk and just function as a human being, you're talking about 15-20% capacity. Elite athletes, say somebody like a Lance Armstrong, might use 50 or 60% of his total lung capacity to do what he does. He's very efficient. A wind instrumentalist is going to be using closer to 85 to 90% of what they're capable of taking in. And the real trick is teaching students how to have an elasticity to their body, an ability to expand in areas that I like to say it's not really fat, it's a tone pit. You have to learn to involve a lot of different muscles in your body so that you can not only take in a large breath, but more importantly, you have to learn how to control the exhalation of a large breath. Those are skills that can be taught and should be taught in many ways away from the instrument. Just getting in tune with the fact that breathing correctly on a brass instrument, for instance, is going to involve a type of skill that you don't use normally when you don't have the instrument in your face. So you have to learn a whole different way of expanding, relaxing, yet focusing your body when you're breathing. Understanding the business of music is a critical element, not only to succeeding, but to surviving and thriving. We call it the music business. Those are two words. There's music and there's business. There's understanding that you have to find, depending on what it is that you are trying to accomplish with your career, you have to find a way to communicate that, not just through your instrument, but through your whole being. You could be a great player, but if you're not a lot of fun to be with on a gig because you have a holier-than-thou attitude or whatever, you're not going to get called back very often. You have to be respectful of people that you're working with. You have to understand that they have things to offer, you have things to offer. Understanding how speech patterns work, how we work in rehearsal. Musicians will often, especially when they're younger, will say things like, well, I think you're playing that too fast, or that's too slow, or you're sharp, I think you're too loud. These are very aggressive statements. We do them without even necessarily thinking. And you know, you might even be right, but sometimes being right isn't necessarily what it's about. Understanding how we communicate, saying things like, could we pay attention to letter B? Knowing full well that the trombone player is probably dragging, but instead of addressing the trombonist directly, you're saying to the whole group, how about we focus on that aspect of this particular phrase? Those are speech patterns that you can get into that just make you somebody other musicians want to be around. Now, the other element of marketing yourself as a musician is that marketing yourself is not a bad thing to say. Again, coming back to my teacher at Juilliard, one of the important things that he told me is, well, what's your hook? Well, I have a really great sound. You know, I told him I like to play with a beautiful tone, and I think my phrasing is used. Yeah, I got good tone too, and I can phrase pretty well too. So what's your hook? And he would keep hammering, and I didn't understand that for the longest time. And it was all part of the process of him challenging me, saying, you know what, you have to be different. You have to be different. And I'm very fond of telling students that if you're different, you are the best at what you're doing because you create your own subcategory. If you are trying to be better than somebody else, then you're competing with people, and that's the wrong motivation. It's not a pure form of trying to attain success. True success is absolutely dependent on you deciding what you want to present and presenting it in a way that is so honest that people are drawn to it like a moth to a flame. So it's a simple thing to say, but it must be addressed on an individual basis. There's no one set way to do it. Again, there are tools that you can learn for putting press kits together. With the advent of the internet especially, building websites, which are really a portal to what it is that you have to offer, especially if your career is outside of your community. Within any community, whether it's a city or a town or an area, people all get to know each other. But if you're trying to expand your career either as a soloist or as a chamber group that wants to play abroad in your state, your country, around the world, well, the only people who are going to get to know you is through some form of media. And that has to involve the internet at this point. So how you present yourself on a computer screen is paramount to having some kind of an identity that people will be able to relate to. I did notice that when I was playing with the Canadian Brass, I toured with them for almost 6 years, and we were doing 120 to 130 concerts a year sometimes, that if you really did have to take care of yourself because your body would get run down very, very quickly just from the sheer amount of travel that was involved. And you realize very quickly that you're not going to be able to operate at peak efficiency if you're not keeping an eye on your general well-being. I do happen to think that aerobic activity in particular is a really, really good thing for all musicians to do. Not only because of the obvious health benefits, but because as a wind player, if I'm doing any kind of an aerobic activity, what I'm ultimately trying to do is get in tune with the rhythm of my breathing. The more you exert yourself in a physical activity, especially one that involves some kind of repetition, whether it's running or swimming or walking on a treadmill, something that has a rhythmic element to it, that gets you in touch with your body starting to fatigue, and how the intake and exhalation of air coincides with the degree of fatigue that you're going through. So I see nothing but benefits from pushing your body a little bit outside of its comfort zone so that it becomes more efficient, and you as a result become more in tune with your own body. If you do that, I think it really, in fact I know it will help your career a tremendous amount. I hear that all the time, parents being concerned about their child going into a profession in the arts. My own parents were just as concerned about that as any other parent would be. And it's only because parents are well-intentioned. And the first thing that comes to mind when you say, I'm going to have a career in the arts, they're thinking, my child is going to be poor forever. It's a stereotype of our industry. And parents want the best for their children, so it's natural that you would be protective from that standpoint. What I would encourage a lot of parents and students to do is read up and understand how many areas of the arts that one can actually contribute in to actually make a living. One of the best lectures I ever got was a university professor that had come to our high school to tell us how many different areas of the music industry you could make a living in, not just in performing. Obviously in education. What about in producing? What about in recording? What about in fostering other talent, becoming either a talent agent or a production company, having your hand involved in presenting a concert series, being a contributing member to your community in a lot of ways. There are so many areas that you can be involved in the arts that are very, very gratifying. It might start off just as due to the fact that you might want to become a professional trumpet player. But I can assure you that somewhere along the line, if you've chosen a good mentor, a good university, a place that has a nurturing environment, that 4-year period that you're doing an undergraduate degree will probably enlighten you to many, many other facets of the industry that you can be involved in. Further, coming out with a bachelor's degree in anything, if you don't want to end up going into music, transferring into some other field is a very, very doable thing to do. In fact, I had been told by a dean of law at the university that I had, in the city that I had grown up in, that a music degree was valued very, very highly when people were applying to law school, because lawyers basically understand that in order to be a musician, especially a successful one, there's no such thing as ever finishing your job. You're constantly obsessed with trying to improve, modify. You're working in a world of gray where there's not a right or a wrong answer necessarily. There's only a convincing way to present something. And that's essentially what law is all about. What's right or wrong. So there are many, many ways that you can spin off a career that begins in the arts into something else. As a musician, studying methods, studying techniques, these are basically problem-solving techniques that you have to develop in order to improve as a performer. Those are traits that can be applied to any field. Further, it allows you to really think outside of any kind of a restrictive box. And I can't think of very many successful people that I'm aware of that don't have that as their first and foremost skill. In fact, many people that I really admire in the field of business I get along with very, very well because they are creative thinkers about their company, about what it is that they want to accomplish. And that's entirely what music is about. It's about you taking responsibility for your own success and failure, not dropping that in your teacher's lap. You have a good long look in the mirror and then come up with the answer. That's a trait that carries through in any field. I happen to play Yamaha trumpets, and I have custom-made mouthpieces made by Gary Radke, or GR mouthpieces. I've played Yamahas my entire career, ever since I was in high school, and I'm particularly fond of the way Yamahas play because the instruments are made very, very well in tune. They're very balanced. I don't have to really fight with them very much. And as far as I'm concerned, any instrument, regardless of what instrument you end up choosing, whether it's a Yamaha or some other horn, if the horn has inherent isms, shall we say, trumpet players often will grow up saying, well, play this make or this make or this make, but you know, the G is inherently high and the D is a little flat and the E flat could be this or that, use an alternate fingering. If we accept that as part of what the instrument is about, then you've shortchanged yourself. You shouldn't accept that. An instrument should be an extension of your own imagination. So it's very important to find an instrument that allows you to basically not have to fight with it, but rather work with it. My mouthpiece choice is based on a very compact and focused rim with a reasonably deep cup, which allows me to still have a warm, round sound, but the focused rim of the mouthpiece itself also allows me to basically not have to work quite as hard. You also have to blow differently in a more compact mouthpiece than you can in a bigger mouthpiece. Generally what will happen if you play big mouthpiece and you switch to something smaller, it'll back up on you. And then people automatically say, oh, I can't play that because it's too small. My lips are too this or that, or I need a bigger bore size or whatever. That's not true at all. There's nothing wrong with the mouthpiece. There's something wrong with the way you blow, which means you're not willing to modify that. If you're not willing to do that, then yeah, you're right. It probably won't work for you. If you are willing to think in a slightly different manner, you can make something else work for you. And generally, with a smaller rimmed mouthpiece, you have to hit the center of the note. If you're a little bit outside of it, it'll back up on you. With a bigger mouthpiece, you have a bigger target. So the efficiency factor has to be maximized with more compact gear. But the trade-off is that if you're playing the trumpet more efficiently, I think the rest speaks for itself. That's why I'm a big, big fan of saying focus your rim size. And incidentally, if you have a career that you want to develop as a symphonic player and you think, well, Jens is a very fine trumpet player, but he's ultimately a soloist. He doesn't understand what it takes to be in an orchestra. My biggest hero these days is a young man named John Hagstrom, who's the second trumpet in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, who plays a mouthpiece that's basically about a 5 rim with about a 1.5, 1.25 cup. Second trumpet in one of the greatest brass sections in the world, playing all those low notes. Now, if you don't believe me and you don't think you get in an orchestra, when you're playing in the Chicago Symphony, then you can tell me it's not possible. But John Hagstrom is doing it and there are others doing it. So at least leave yourself the option to consider it as a possibility. This is a common question asked by trumpet players all around the world. Every master class you go to, somebody's going to ask, how do I develop my high range? Here's the first myth that often occurs when we talk about playing in the high register. People think that in order to play higher, you have to blow more. It is the exact opposite. There is so little air that goes through the trumpet when you're playing even from a G on top of the staff to beyond that. So little air. What has to be developed is a really, really great middle register. I call it the golden sixth, from a second line G in the treble clef staff to a top space E. That basically embouchure set has to exist right in that sixth. Everything beyond that, instead of thinking up, I ask students not to think from low to high, but from low to high, further away. It changes the concept of how you blow into the instrument. It's like taking a straw and a spitball. If you want to, put something through that straw and it doesn't quite get to your destination, it has to go a little farther. You spit with more velocity. Now, you can't change the size of the straw, that hasn't changed, but you've altered your approach to how you're going to get distance on the spitball. Exact same concept when it comes to working in the high range. It's also very important that students understand that the idea of playing in the upper register exists because you have a very focused aperture on the trumpet. Often you'll hear 12 or 13-year-olds, they'll grab a trumpet and they just purse their lips together and they're squeaking out some high F. It's really just a scratchy sound, and they're thinking, this is great, I'm playing a double F, listen to me, and somewhere along the line you become a professional or an advanced student of the instrument and you say, well, that's not really a note. I got news for you, it is a note. What young people are doing is actually having the perfect embouchure set to create vibration and ultimately sound for the high notes. Now, what you have to learn to do is keep that set, yet increase the flow of air without having the aperture open too much. Once the embouchure opens too much, then you're going to have a lot more difficulty holding the lips in place and getting the necessary vibrational frequencies to play in the upper register. And this is why I am such an advocate of saying, why are you playing a really huge mouthpiece? If you're playing something that's gargantuan, the biggest thing on the market, and you're having trouble playing over high C, there's probably a reason for it. Why don't you allow the mouthpiece to help do a lot of the work for you? As trumpet players, we don't even think twice about grabbing a piccolo trumpet and putting in a small mouthpiece. It's normal. Well, why wouldn't you adopt the same principles on the piccolo trumpet and apply those to the way you approach playing the B-flat trumpet? The two go hand in hand. There's probably a middle ground, but that's the key word. You can probably find something in the middle that'll allow you to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Getting students to understand that is one of the great challenges. Learning to play in the mid and mid-upper register softly is another challenge. It's a very, very difficult thing to teach a student to do. If they can develop that kind of control, then simply increasing the flow rate of air and increasing the speed will start to allow the sound to open up in the volume and the projection and all those other good things. It's not really a difficult concept. When you really get it, you just kind of bang your head against the wall and say, I can't believe I ever thought it was that difficult. And believe me, I wasn't a natural high note player when I started. Some people are, and they can just do it. They're set up to do it. I absolutely learned how to play in the high range, and there is a methodology to it. It has to be done intelligently, but it can be learned. There's no question about it. there's a lot of things that I still see myself doing. It's ironic because I'm now a university professor, and I remember when I was a student at university, I like to call my old teacher once in a while and say, you know, I'm the same age now that you were when you first met me. When I was a student, I thought you were such an old fart. So I'd be naive to think that my own students wouldn't necessarily think of that, you know, when it comes to me. The difference is that once you attain a certain amount of experience in the industry, you realize that the beauty of it is that you're just there, you're just getting started. There's a number of things I would still like to accomplish. Having toured with the Canadian Brass was a very, very interesting experience for me because it's a group that's obviously attained a world-famous stature and has performed in every major concert hall on the planet. 5 brass players. Who would have thought that that was possible when they first started out? But they've done it. The formula was ultimately really, really simple. It was based on holding the attention of young children. That's how the Canadian Brass started. They were an outreach group, you know, members of the Hamilton Philharmonic, and they did 200 children's shows a year, sometimes 3 or 4 shows a day. Now kids, young children, if they don't like what you're doing, if they're bored, they're not going to be polite. They will tune you out, and that's it. You've lost them. So if you can find a way to hold their attention, you've accomplished something. Now, the formula is really simple. If you can do that with young children, the same formula works with adults, and they actually pay to buy tickets and CDs and support careers. So becoming subservient to the audience, understanding that our goal is to hold their attention, that's one of the great challenges that all performers like to tackle head on. In my own case, because I like to play many, many different styles of music in an evening, the key element of my own career that I'm continually trying to hone is the ability to present a concert in a different light. Literally, not just figuratively. Why don't we have movement on stage? Why, as classical and jazz musicians, don't we start playing with lighting design, for instance? Rock and roll acts have done this forever. I mean, who are we to think we shouldn't have some mood lighting going on here? It completely can alter the type of piece that you're presenting, and there is as much an art form to that as there is to anything. So one of the big elements of my own career down the road is going to be working on projects that integrally involve things like lighting design in particular, to present the same music that I could do with standard concert lights up, but it's presented in a different way. I think that's one of the very, very overlooked elements of concert presentation. The first thing I would tell anybody that's at a pre-college age that is involved in arts and music, get involved with your bands, your choirs, whatever it is that you have at your particular school, and make sure that there is a significant social component to it. One of the beautiful things about music is that really you have to do it with other people around you. I mean, imagine playing a trumpet and having nothing else on stage. Who's going to come to that concert? Nobody, except other trumpet players, and they're going to sneak in for free. They'll never buy a ticket. At the very least, you're going to be working with a piano player. In all likelihood, you'll be with a band or an orchestra or a chamber group. The experience of playing in a band as a young person is that you're around other people that have the same interest as you, and you can and should learn from each other. So the social interaction of playing music in and of itself is not only a really fun thing to do, it's a vital thing to do to find where your place is, where your identity is, that you have to coexist with others in some capacity. And you can learn that as a young person. The most important thing to think about at that age is you should be enjoying it. It's supposed to be fun. It started off as being fun, and any professional that tells you this isn't fun is a professional that you shouldn't be listening to. The good pros still have a good time doing it. The crusty, bitter pros, don't study with them. That's not fun, and you don't want it to be that, because that's not what it was when we got into it. That's the thing I would say hang on to more than anything, and you can start that at an early age, and you can keep that your entire career if you do it right.
Thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.